to fly without a plane and win an entire island. A billionaire offered it as a joke. What the stranger did next defies explanation in any science book. The Caribbean Sea held that impossible blue that only exists on August afternoons, when the sun sets in the west and transforms the water into something that seems painted rather than real. Off the coast of Cartagena de Indias, 16 kilometers from the mainland, Isla Dorada stretched its 3 kilometers of white sand beach and tall palm trees beneath a cloudless sky. It was the most coveted private island in the Colombian Caribbean. And for 11 years, it had belonged to a single man. Alejandro Montoya Ros, 58 years old, $2,300,000,000, hotel chains in 7 countries, a 42-meter yacht called Invincible that was anchored that day off the main beach of his island with 27 guests on board. Businessmen, politicians, a former president of a country that preferred not to be named, 3 soap opera actresses, 2 retired world boxing champions, and several men who were involved in things that on their business cards said consulting but in reality meant power. Alejandro Montoya had been celebrating his 58th birthday on that island for 4 days, not because the number itself mattered to him, but because he wanted everyone to know he could afford it. He was a man made of demonstrations. From childhood in Medellín, in the Laureles neighborhood, where his father was a mechanic and his mother sewed other people's clothes to pay for school, Alejandro had learned that the world had 2 kinds of people, those who looked and those who were looked at. It took him until he was 23 to cross that line. And since then, he hadn't stopped drifting away from the shore where he was born. The problem with men who build themselves on resentment is that they never finish building themselves. There's always one more tower. There's always a bigger ship. There's always an island that isn't yet theirs. And when there's nothing left to buy, they start buying other people's humiliations, because that too feels like power. On the morning of the 5th day, while the guests were having breakfast on the main deck of the yacht with passion fruit juice and eggs Benedict, one of the security guards approached Alejandro with an expression that was not exactly alarmed, but neither was it calm. "Sir, there's a man on the beach." Alejandro looked up from his coffee. "What man?" "We don't know how he got there. He didn't arrive by boat. He didn't arrive in any vessel. The lifeguards on the shore say he just appeared. He was walking along the beach as if he'd always been there." Alejandro Montoya placed the cup on the teakwood table with a soft sound and stood up with the slowness of someone who has all the time in the world because the world belongs to him. "Put me down in the boat," he said. The man was standing facing the sea when Alejandro arrived on the beach with 4 security guards and 6 of his guests who had decided to follow him out of curiosity or boredom, which, with that sort of people, is almost always the same thing. He was a young man, about 35 years old, with dark hair and the tanned skin of someone accustomed to the sun. He wore a simple beige tunic, worn at the shoulders, and old leather sandals with straps frayed from use. His hands were large and calloused. His feet were bare on the damp white sand. He didn't gaze at the horizon with the expression of a shipwrecked man, nor with the anguish of someone lost. He looked at the sea with the unique tranquility of someone who has known water since before water had a name. When she heard the footsteps, she turned around. And she smiled. Not with the smile of someone apologizing, with the smile of someone who was expecting this exact arrival. Alejandro studied it from top to bottom, with that gaze trained over years of calculating the value of things. "How did you get to my island?" "Walking," the stranger replied. Alejandro waited for the second part of the answer. It didn't come. "Walking from where?" "We are 16 kilometers from solid ground." The stranger looked at the sea. Then he looked at Alexander. From there, he simply said. The silence that followed was brief, but carried the weight of things that defy immediate explanation. One of the guests, a businessman from Barranquilla in his 50s, looked at the water and then at the stranger's feet. No shoes, no wetsuit. No trace of the dampness the sea leaves on the clothes of someone who has just crossed 16 kilometers of open water. The tunic was dry. The sandals were dry. The skin was dry. Alejandro processed it too. And he chose the response he always chose when something didn't fit into his worldview. He turned it into entertainment. She turned to her guests with a slow, calculated smile and raised her voice so that everyone could hear her clearly. Very well, my friend. You say you arrived walking on water. How about you do it again? Here. Now, in front of all of us. And if you fly without a plane, if you walk on water in front of all my guests, I'll give you the island. The whole thing. Deeded, legal mine for 11 years now. If you do something impossible, it's yours. Laughter erupted from all sides at once. The guards grinned. Two of the actresses applauded the joke. The former president of that unnamed country laughed a deep, guttural laugh. Alejandro Montoya opened his arms like a circus ringmaster and waited for the stranger to either turn away in embarrassment, ask for food, or finally explain the joke. The stranger did none of those things. She looked at Alejandro for a full 3 seconds. Then she looked at each of the guests one by one, with a slowness that extinguished their smiles one by one like candles in a drafty room. And then she said, in that soft voice that didn't need volume to fill the space, I accept. Hello, dear brother, dear sister. Thank you for being here with me in this story. Leave a like if it's already touching your heart, and tell us in the comments what country you're watching from. Now let's continue. Nobody laughed this time. Something strange happened on the beach of Isla Dorada. The sun was still shining. The sea was still the same impossibly blue Caribbean sea in August. The palm trees were still swaying in that gentle breeze that made this place what luxury magazines called paradise. But something had changed in the air. Something none of the 21 present could name at the time, but which they all felt exactly the same. The feeling that they were about to see something they wouldn't have the words to describe afterward. The stranger took off his sandals and carefully placed them on the sand. He rolled up his tunic to his knees and walked toward the water. Alejandro Montoya watched him with his arms crossed, and that smile meant to project mockery, but which in the last 30 seconds had lost some of its firmness. The guards were still. The businessman from Barranquilla had taken 2 steps forward without realizing it. The stranger reached the shore. The water touched his feet, and he kept walking. The first step on the water was so natural that several of those present took a second to process what they were seeing. The foot touched the surface of the Caribbean and didn't sink. The water tensed slightly beneath his weight, like the surface of a drum gently struck, and the man continued. Second step. Third, his feet on the water, with the same confidence with which any man walks on the asphalt of a familiar street. He stopped 4 meters from the shore. He was standing on the Caribbean. The water reached exactly to his ankles, but didn't go in. Beneath his feet, the sea was solid. He turned back towards the beach. The silence was total. No one spoke. No one moved. The actress who had applauded Alejandro's quip still had her hand raised to her chest, frozen in place on the way back. The former president's eyes were wide open, with an expression that is extraordinarily rare in men of his profession because power teaches you to show nothing. The businessman from Barranquilla had his lips parted and hadn't even noticed. Alejandro Montoya stared at the man standing on the water. His mind, a mind trained for 40 years to find the trick in any situation, searching for an explanation. A transparent glass platform. An invisible sandbar. Some light trick, some effect, some carefully orchestrated deception, but the water around the stranger's feet moved in the breeze. It was real water. Deep, the white sandy bottom was visible 4 or 5 meters beyond, and then the dark blue that marked the sharp drop to the reef. There was no trick. The stranger took 4 more steps further in. The water reached his calf, then his knee. He continued walking on the surface as if gravity had decided to make an exception for him. 20 meters from the shore, he stopped again. The sea around him was perfectly calm, although further out the waves continued to break normally. He raised his eyes to the sky. And then the second thing happened. If this story is already touching your heart, help us fulfill our dream, reaching 100,000 subscribers before Christmas. That's our dream. Press the red subscribe button right now. It's completely free and helps us tremendously to continue sharing these testimonies of faith. Like this video and comment with the city you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. Now, let's continue. It was slow at first, so slow that the brain registered it as an optical illusion rather than reality. The stranger's feet lifted from the water's surface. 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, 5. The beige tunic began to move differently, not with a Caribbean breeze, but with an air rising from below, as if the space between him and the water were an invisible updraft. At 30 centimeters high, one of the security guards stepped back and stepped on the actress behind him, and neither of them said a word because neither could take their eyes off the sea. The man went upstairs. Not suddenly, not dramatically, with the same calm with which she had walked through the water, with the same naturalness with which she had smiled upon reaching the beach, with that specific serenity that produces in those who observe her something between awe and ancient fear, the kind of fear that does not come from danger, but from the presence of something too big for the frame one carries within. 3 meters above the Caribbean, the stranger stopped. He looked at the island. He looked at the yacht. He looked at Alejandro Montoya on the shore. And Alejandro Montoya, with $2,300,000,000, hotel chains in 7 countries, a yacht called Invincible, purchased islands, and a life built on the certainty that everything has a price and everything has an explanation, realized that his knees were trembling. Not like your knees tremble when you're cold, like they tremble when your body knows something your mind still refuses to admit. The stranger descended slowly. His feet returned to the surface of the water. Then he walked back to the shore with that steady, unhurried gait, reached the sand, picked up his sandals, and calmly put them on. Then he looked at Alejandro. "The island doesn't interest me," he said in that soft voice. "I'm interested in you, in what you've been carrying since you were a kid in Laureles, when your father came home late smelling of motor oil and you swore no one would ever see you with your hands dirty again. What you built wasn't just ambition, it was fear. And the fear that builds empires is the loneliest fear there is." Alejandro didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was closed with something that wasn't a lump, but something that came before crying. The preceding pressure. The moment when the body decides it can no longer bear the weight alone. "You know who I am," the stranger said. "It's not a question." Alejandro Montoya nodded very slowly. Once, and in that small, single movement, 40 years of armor fell to the white sand floor before the impossible blue Caribbean of August. The guests watched in silence. The former president had his eyes closed. The businessman from Barranquilla had his hands clasped in front of his chest, a gesture he hadn't consciously made. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now. What you're about to hear is worth every second. like and turn on notifications. Thanks, brother. The stranger placed a hand on Alejandro Montoya's shoulder. Just that. A hand. But the man who had never allowed anyone to lay a hand on him without his permission didn't move. He remained completely still, his eyes closed, two slow tears trickling down a face that, in 40 years of Forbes photos and business magazine covers, had never shown a single crack. You know me by many names, Alejandro, the stranger said softly. Just softly enough for him to hear, though several of those present later claimed to have heard every word with impossible clarity given the distance. Way, truth, life, light of the world, bread of life, shepherd, alpha, and omega. But the name that matters most to me is the one you will use when you meet me face to face, and on that day, you will no longer need any island to know who you are. When the stranger withdrew his hand and turned back toward the water, Alejandro Montoya sat down on the sand, not gradually. He sat down the way men sit when their legs are no longer an issue, and one of his security guards, who had been protecting him for 9 years, crouched down beside him without being asked and placed a hand on his arm. The stranger walked back to the sea, his feet in the water, his step firm. The beige tunic moving in the Caribbean breeze. 21 people on the shore watched silently as he walked away toward the horizon until the blue of the sea and the blue of the sky met him, and there was no longer any way to distinguish where one ended and the other began. No one took photos. No one recorded a video. Later, when asked why, none of them could give a satisfactory answer. They only said that it hadn't felt like the moment to take out their phones. It had felt like the moment to keep their hands still and their eyes open and simply be present. In the 4 months that followed, Alejandro Montoya Ros did 3 things none of his business partners anticipated. First, he signed over the donation of Isla Dorada to a foundation that would build a rehabilitation center for homeless youth from Medellín, Cartagena, and Barranquilla. Second, he traveled alone to Laureles, the neighborhood where he grew up, and searched for the auto repair shop where his father had worked. The shop was gone, but he found an elderly man who had known him and sat with him for 2 hours in a corner store, drinking coffee and listening to stories about his father that he had never heard before. Third, he called all his lowest-level employees in Colombia, from doormen to cleaning staff, and created an education fund for his children. 732 beneficiaries in the first year. He wasn't the same man. The businessman from Barranquilla who was on the beach that day later said in an interview he couldn't avoid giving, "I'd been an atheist since I was 20. I had my reasons, and I defended them well. But what I saw that day in the Caribbean doesn't fit into any of my mental frameworks. And when something doesn't fit into any framework you have, you either invent a new one or you recognize that the world is bigger than all your frameworks combined. Today, right now, you too can receive what Alexander received on that beach. You don't need an island. You don't need 2 billion. You don't need to have built anything enormous or failed at anything enormous. You only need the willingness to be still when something greater than yourself places a hand on your shoulder." Jesus continues to walk on the waters of our lives. On the seas we believe no one can cross. On the distances we build between ourselves and Him, believing they are too wide for any bridge. They're not too wide. Remember, dear brother, dear sister, no matter how lost you feel, no matter how many mistakes you've made, no matter how far you think you are from God, Jesus is still walking among us, seeking willing hearts. He didn't come to condemn you. He came to save you. He didn't come to humiliate you. He came to set you free. He didn't come to remind you of your failures. He came to show you your potential. May God bless you abundantly. May He fill your life with purpose, your heart with peace, and your future with hope. And never forget that you are infinitely loved, valued, and called to great things. See you in the next video. May the peace of Christ be with you always. Amen.